Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to do another little comparison discussion revolving around bullpups. Now, previously I did a bullpup comparison video where I was primarily looking at comparing the AR-15 to bullpups in general, but specifically the IWI X95 Tavor right here, previously reviewed on the channel, and I used this LWRC M6 IC A5, also previously reviewed on the channel. I'll put the links to all three of the videos we discussed so far in the description. Now, the goal there was to kind of compare the difference in manual of arms between the two systems. And it's very important to do this based around an AR-15 because the AR is kind of the gold standard in U.S. firearms training. I mean, if you're talking about military, law enforcement, all those types of things, those guys are utilizing AR-15s. They're incredibly popular on the civilian market as well. So pretty much anytime you go to a training course, unless you specified a course for a different weapon system, it's based around the AR-15. The grading standards and criteria that are utilized in that course are based around the AR-15. Your instructors are already thinking in terms of AR-15. When you show up with something that's not an AR-15, it gets a little weird, a little challenging. I recently took my IWI Galil Ace to a course, and the guys were a little thrown off because I didn't bring an AK. I brought an AK, or excuse me, I didn't bring an AR, I brought an AK variant. So a lot of their standards and all that kind of stuff had to be readdressed to kind of take into account what it was that I was using. And of course, I still tried to make the AR-15 standard and had a struggle trying to do so. Now, the other goal of that video kind of took a sort of circuitous route to be able to get to this point. And guys, keep in mind, I have a tendency to go down rabbit holes. So if you're in a hurry, check the description, go ahead and pop to the different sections that you actually want to watch so you can get the information that you want going about your day. Now, the other aspect of that I wanted to compare was also the barrel length. So both of these rifles utilize a 16-inch barrel. However, the bullpups in general, but especially the X95, are drastically shorter than your average 16-inch AR-15 by about 5 inches roughly. And it changes depending on which weapon system, which bullpup system it is that you're talking about. Now, the goal there was to get into a kind of confined space type mindset and see which weapon system was easier to be able to utilize in those confined spaces. Now, the goal of these comparisons is not necessarily to give you guys a de facto answer on which is better as much as it is to represent data, allow you guys to kind of formulate your own opinions, and then throw in some of my own personal observations along the way. Now, having trained my entire adult life around the AR-15, all of my tactical training has been formed in that light, so I have a tendency to still run an AR-15 better than pretty much anything else that I work around. So working around the barrier and stuff like that was much easier for me on the AR-15 than it was on the X95. We'll talk about that more as we go. However, the X95 was not impossible to work around as much as we did identify a couple of things that you have to keep in mind when you do that. And for more information on that, check out that video. Now, the goal this time was to compare overall length, not just barrel length. Now, the X95 comes in at 26, just over 26 inches. So, of course, this means that I'm either have to go to SBRs or what I refer to as 3 points of contact pistols. Now, the range that I'm shooting at is across the state line, and I'm not necessarily interested in getting tangled up in NFA type issues with that, so I did not wind up taking my SBR. In addition to that, my SBR is chambered in 300 blackout, and though these comparisons are by no means scientific, I do not necessarily want to introduce a different cartridge into the mix. So I wanted to keep it around 5.56 guns. So for this, I turned to my friends who happen to have what I refer to as 3 points of contact pistols or AR pistols. So for that, I went to this BCM 11.5-inch AR pistol, chambered in 5.56, of course. Now, a very quick size comparison shows us that the BCM is just a tad longer than the X95. But there's a couple things that I liked about this choice. We're shrinking barrels, so we have to start taking into account different aspects that come into shrinking barrels. That's diminished velocity, increased muzzle blast, as well as muzzle flash, and then also a lot of different functional type aspects. I like, conceptually, though I at this point have no 3 points of contact pistols of my own, I like 11.5-inch, 12.5-inch barrels whenever I'm evaluating short setups. Whenever I'm planning out a new SBR or AR pistol build, I'm primarily looking at those barrel lengths. And that's because I like being able to get stretched out on the gun still, while also having a little bit more velocity in the shorter overall package and all that kind of stuff. And that's just some of the things that you kind of got to think about or discuss whenever it is that you're looking at doing these types of setups. Now, historically, I have not been in a rush to get an AR pistol or anything along those lines because I have the X95 and it is so short, and it's shorter than quite a few pistol setups out there on the market. And that makes this thing fantastic for close quarters type stuff, as well as a truck gun. The X95 is a go-to truck gun for me. So now the question becomes, how does it compare to these pistols? What are some dynamics that we have to take into account? Now, guys, I don't have a building to be able to run through and do a lot of the CQB type stuff, but I do still have my VTAC barrier and I can work around that. Now, in the previous video, we also did a lot of stuff with like comparing different, reloads and all that kind of stuff. And that was primarily comparing bullpups versus standard AR-15s in that case. We're going to do a little bit less of that in this video. Now, first off, let's go ahead and talk about shoulder transitions though, because that is kind of a key thing to call attention to as far as manual of arms is concerned between these two weapon systems. I get to retain AR-15 manipulations when I shrink the AR-15 pattern into an SBR or a pistol, whereas I might have to change things up a little bit here, and we can see that in shoulder transitions. So in shoulder transitions between these two guns, so I talked about this beforehand with the X95, and it might be easier to actually come back and grab the magazine and then conduct your transitions that way. However, that is a kind of major departure to the vast majority of other weapon systems when your magazine well is located out here, and it's much easier to grab there and bring it across. I prefer that manner of manipulation. It only becomes problematic in bullpups, because of the rearward weight bias on the weapon system with our receiver and our magazine well all located back here. But it's still doable to grab here and transition it back and forth in a similar manner that you would do with an AR-15. So I found those two, I found that to be a pretty easy way to be able to maintain that same manual of arms there, and no real issue in doing so. Now, something else to talk about in general with shooting. I prefer rifle setups over a lot of these 3 points of contact pistols, and a lot of that comes back to the brace. And this has been my opinion going into things. We'll talk about how some of my consideration for this has changed a little bit. My issue with the brace is that these things do not maintain a shape. If they maintained a shape, they would be considered a stock by the ATF, and then we wouldn't be able to put them on these short type setups. So a lot of people consider braces to be this loophole whenever it comes to SBR type setups, and I don't entirely agree. My issue with braces is not just that they deform and all that kind of stuff, but they're also originally designed with the intent of this being lashed to your forearm. So they also have a tendency, some of the models out there have a tendency to rotate and all that kind of stuff in order to better be able to accommodate that type of use. That becomes very problematic when it comes time to build that cheek weld on the weapon system, especially since in order to be able to get more of this buffer tube type arrangement into your shoulder, you've kind of got to run it a little bit lower in order to be able to get onto it, which also means that you've got to sink your head more and all that kind of stuff. There's more built into getting that repeatable contact surface with this weapon system than there is with an actual stock, which generally makes me prefer having actual stocks. I have so much more space with this. It is rigid. It is constantly in the same form over and over again. Now, the very obvious counter argument to this is that these that is primarily a concern whenever you're trying to shoot great distances. These are not 500-yard precision setups. That's not the intent of these weapon systems. The intent is for them to be close range type arrangements, and for this works more than enough. Now, there's also a lot of issues that you run into, guys, with, you know, the ATF and their distinction, or how it is that they designate these add-ons, these attachments. They have a tendency to change their opinions on them. They have done so a couple times in the last couple of years. They've attempted to straight up ban them in the last couple of years. Now, be that as it may, currently under their definition, this brace is allowed to occasionally touch your shoulder. Now, there's going to be a lot of that going on in this video because I'm going to be shooting from a lot of unnatural positions, and that's a pretty reasonable time for this to possibly bump into your shoulder, as it may be. So just something to kind of, in case anybody gets their panties in a wad over that, that's why that's going on in this video. And because, you know, reasons. So, with that, let's go ahead and get on the barrier and start talking about these two weapon systems there. All right, starting off with the X95. I had a lot of the same things that I noticed last time. Now, first off, guys, this optic is really driving me nuts. So right now, here indoors in a relatively shaded area, I have no problem seeing this dot. In fact, actually, if anything, it's definitely kind of distorted a little bit because I have the power dialed all the way up. Out there on the range, I don't know if it's the angle of light or what, it's completely blotting out my dot. It's making it incredibly difficult to pick up, which is meaning that it's taking me more time to pick up and actually align the shot on the barrier. I've never had this issue with this optic until I started shooting it at this particular range. I've shot competitions at the other place and have never, in a wide variety of lighting conditions, and never had issues staying with this dot. So this is an irritation. It's getting really old, really fast. So, how did it do on the barrier? Well, it did fine. One of my only real complaints, other than the dot, but it kind of plays into with the dot, is trying to, in the ultra low, kind of very unnatural positions, trying to find the dot in order to be able to engage the target. It's a lot of effort involved in that. And I think a lot of it has to do with how compact the setup is overall, to where maybe I'm a little too scrunched up on things, especially once I get down very low. Now, something else that stands to be called out whenever we're talking about doing shoulder transitions and stuff, before I forgot to mention this, but I did wind up with a shell casing brushing my chin. A lot of times that happens whenever I have the gun, you know, whenever I'm doing cross shoulder type stuff and I have the gun, my head a little too far forward in how it is that I came up on it, and sometimes that causes me to take a couple of shell casings to the chin. It's something that's avoidable, it's just something you have to keep in mind. And especially once you start working down in those kind of awkward positions, it might happen more often. Just something to consider with those. Now, how did the BCM compare? Couple of observations about the BCM. First off, this optic is set much lower than what I would normally set my optics at. This was set up by the owner so that he would have less of an issue with height over bore, and that's a pure preference type thing. We're not necessarily rating setups on here and how I feel about them as much as we're talking about them in play, but that's important because with how low this was, I did have to spend a little bit more time trying to get down behind the gun. And in addition to that, sling management is an important aspect. It's definitely good to tape these up whenever you get the chance so that they don't, in those awkward positions, wind up getting across your optics or anything like that. I had that happen a couple of times with this gun. But as far as engagement type stuff was concerned, I had no real concerns up until we start talking about muzzle blast. So at the start, I had no real issues. I didn't even notice the muzzle blast, honestly. Until I got to the rolled over kneeling position. And that was the first time that I really noticed the muzzle blast. And that was also the first time that the gun was really getting pressed into the barrier and that the barrier completely surrounded the gun instead of being on top of the barrier like it was in the earlier positions. And that continued all the way through the prone positions where I was definitely getting a lot more of that blast wave being reflected back onto me off of the barrier. It was noticeable. Now, was it an issue? Conditionally. I could see where it would get very annoying if I did that for an entire day. I could see that being potentially headache inducing or something along those lines. That's definitely something I noticed about it, but it wasn't bad enough that I couldn't finish my day of shooting with this particular weapon system. All right, so that's how these two setups did off of the barrier. But let's talk about something else real quick, because this setup, the BCM, is just a little bit longer than the X95. What if I had something that was more size akin? Perhaps like this 8-inch AR-15 pistol, also borrowed from a friend. So we can do a real quick size comparison here, and we can see that actually this 8-inch AR is just a little bit shorter than this X95. So how does this thing work into that whole dynamic when it comes to blast and shoulder transitions and all that kind of stuff? So first off, let's go ahead and check out shoulder transitions.
Go.
So we can see standard AR-15. The only thing to really note is that I did not take brass to the face while I was shooting it. So there's that. That's pretty cool. How did it do on the barrier though, with this short of a barrel? All right, guys, now talking about my own kind of like preconceived notions and all that kind of stuff, I expected this thing to just completely make shooting it around the barrier unbearable. However, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that it wasn't that bad. So I really didn't get a lot of blast reflected back on me up until I hit the ground. Once I got down into the super low prone positions and the rollover type positions, that's when I really started noticing a lot of the concussion coming back on me. But prior to that, this flash can was doing a great job of keeping a lot of that energy moving forward. However, that is one of the issues whenever we're talking about these short type setups and utilizing flash cans. If you're going to use this indoors, that stuff's going to come back on you. It's going to rebound off of walls, blast waves doing what it is that they do, you know, all reflection and all that kind of stuff. You're going to ring your bell pretty good with really any rifle cartridge in a confined space, if I'm being completely honest. So, however, working around the barrier and all that kind of stuff, this thing was really great to be able to stay nice and tucked in, close to cover and all that. I had no real issues manipulating around it, and actually, if anything, this was probably the easiest one out of the bunch. But we still got this blast issue. So how do we go about talking about this? Well, obviously, if you're going to go and fight indoors and all that kind of stuff, suppressors are a great thing to consider, not just from a standpoint of considering your hearing or not letting the bad guys know where you are. Really, it's a huge portion when it comes to communication potentially, as well as not necessarily having all of that blast and pressure coming back onto your face. Now, the owner of this pistol setup does have a suppressor to go along with it. He has a Griffin Armament M4 SDK. If I have that designation wrong, I'll annotate it below, but I'm pretty sure that's the proper designation for it. He has the gate lock type setup that goes with this muzzle device. So I decided to go ahead and run the barrier with that. All right, so a couple of observations. One of the great things about going with short setups overall is to be able to add a suppressor and not necessarily come out to the same obscene length that you wind up having when you add a suppressor to a 16-inch gun. You manage to keep something that is going to wind up probably being a little bit longer than a 16-inch gun, depending on what barrel length you put the suppressor on, but it's not an over 20-inch gun at that point. At that point, you're looking at, you know, a 17-inch overall length with the suppressor added into, say, this 11.5. That's not so bad. That's something that can definitely still be worked around a barrier and all that kind of stuff. Now, I definitely noticed less of an issue with concussion, but one thing that really changed up was back pressure. So as I got down to the ground and did the two sideways rollover positions, both rounds on those wound up putting a lot of spray, a lot of gas back into my face. And my only assumption could be that it was, because that's not a high back pressure can type setup, and it's something that the owner has never noticed happen to him before. And I think that might have to do with my position on the ground in relation to the ejection port. I think I was getting gases back that way. And normally, like I say, it's not been an issue for him, but that's just something that I noticed. And it was not inhibitive. It's not like it caused my eyes to water up or anything like that, just off of the 2 rounds that I fired. But perhaps a whole magazine or more rounds being expended would give that an issue. Just something to consider overall there. However, from an overall length type aspect, it was still very easy to work around the barrier. I had no issue getting into the positions that I needed to get into that were not complicated by the sling. Now, I didn't test out that same suppressor on anything else. I would expect the results to be very similar. The one caveat that I would add is that suppressors with X95s have been known to have a lot of back pressure, and with your face being directly over top of the chamber, that you wind up getting a lot of that in your eyes and stuff like that. So that's something to consider as well. You have to be very diligent in your suppressor choice whenever it is that you're talking about the X95s. I have not found that personally, but that's also because I own no suppressors. I'm working on it. I just haven't gotten around to fully dedicating the time and expense towards getting suppressors. When you got a collection like mine and you decide to make big changes like that, it's kind of an undertaking. So it's something to look forward to in the future. All right, now, what are some other things that we need to talk about with this? Well, guys, we really need to talk about velocities real quick. With 16-inch barreled guns, we still get fairly high velocities, and that's an important thing with the 5.56 cartridge. The 5.56 is built around velocity, and when you take away velocity, you really neuter the cartridge. Now, I've talked about this before in the 5.56 millimeter cartridge videos that I've done. I've done a couple, comparing it to 308, just doing an entire kind of history lesson on the 5.56 itself. The important thing about that cartridge is it's entirely based around the velocity threshold of about 2,500 to 2,600 feet per second in order to get that yaw characteristic that is advocated for being the true advantage of the 5.56. And now, yaw, for those of you who don't know, is when the bullet has a tendency to destabilize once it hits the target media, and it'll start to roll and break apart and fragment, create new wound channels that'll have that big old secondary temporary wound channel and all that kind of stuff. That's the advantage of 5.56. Now, a 16-inch gun still keeps you in a very good association with that velocity out to pretty decent distance. But when you shrink the barrel, you change that dynamic. So 25 to 2,600-ish feet per second, that's what we're talking about in order to be able to have prime yaw characteristic. After that, the bullet destabilizes less. There's less forces to help tear it apart inside of the body and all that kind of stuff. It'll still destabilize, it'll still somewhat come from together, but as we diminish velocity, we diminish that secondary wound channel and all that kind of stuff. So at an 11.5-inch barrel, we are looking with a 55 grain round at about 2,600, 2,700 feet per second at the muzzle. Shading 28, depending on what load it is that you select. Okay, that's decent. However, that velocity is going to taper off very rapidly. With an 8-inch barreled gun, we're talking about, with 55 grain ammunition, 2,600 feet per second, 2,500 feet per second at the muzzle. And again, now a lot of this depends on load, but 2,500 is a pretty decent expectation at the muzzle. So this thing already automatically is dropping below prime yaw characteristic in fairly short order. You're talking about maintaining yaw type advantages under 100 yards with this rifle setup, or excuse me, with this pistol setup. And if you're looking to do an SBR or something along those lines, it would be the same type of deal. Once you're looking at those shorter barrels, you rapidly lose yaw characteristic, and you do still gain a lot of muzzle blast and muzzle flash that you have to do something about taming. In addition to that, it also diminishes your suppressor options. A lot of suppressors are not built to be able to deal with the excessive muzzle flash of shorter barreled setups. It really takes a toll on the blast baffles and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that you have to take into account whenever you're looking at the shorter setups and trying to run them in the same manner that you would run this. Now, the velocity aspect also comes into where it is that you're trying to push the rifle. So if you're talking about just doing indoor stuff, your home defense or SWAT team, entry team, whatever, going with a shorter setup in order to be able to optimize it for that space makes sense. Be it a bullpup, an 8-inch pistol, whatever it is that you're talking about, going with that shorter overall setup is going to make it easier to pie corners, do all the things that you need to be able to do in that confined space while still getting good ballistic performance out of the cartridge. However, if you're looking for a do-all type setup to be able to push this thing out to 300 yards or something along those lines, this could probably still hit 300 yards, but that bullet is not doing a lot of work for you at that point. And that's something that you have to take into account. Already when you're talking about shorter setups and you start reaching out to those greater distances beyond 200 yards, you're kind of talking about getting into the point of the bullet more or less ice picking through the target. And the 22, 55, 62 grain bullet ice picking through a target, not necessarily a significant amount of damage, not really anything to talk about. Is that person still potentially out of the fight? Well, yeah, you put holes in their body that weren't there to begin with. That's probably not good for them. But that doesn't mean that they are permanently out of the fight. That does not mean that they are still not a threat in some way. That's some of the things that we have to keep in mind with there. Now, you can also change that dynamic by going with like the 77 grain OTMs. The Black Hills 77 grain OTM was more or less designed with the idea of being able to work more effectively at long range, but also giving you more mass to be able to be more successful at close range type engagements as well. So now you're looking at more expensive ammunition in order to be able to make that weapon system more capable There's a very significant cost-benefit analysis that you have to work out there. Now, with the 16-inch barrel, you don't have to worry about any of that. And with the Bullpup having such a compact design, you really get a lot of great options with all that velocity. That's kind of the stem of the argument here. However, from a manual of arms type standpoint, going with an 11.5 or 12.5, some of the 13-inch varieties and all that kind of stuff, even down to the 10.5, you get a little bit more velocity. You get a little bit more range out of it. And when you're talking about these types of setups, you're talking about working this stuff at close range to begin with. Once you have all of those opportunities, this doesn't look so bad in order to be able to keep the manual of arms. Is really what it boils down to. You can get this same type of, adaptability, close range use and all that kind of stuff while working around something that's not necessarily going to cause you to trip up at the wrong time, and still have good velocity for your purposes at the end of the day. Something to keep in mind. Now, you throw a short barrel into this bad boy, and I mean, you still got the manual of arms argument, but it becomes even shorter at that point and even easier to work around barriers and all that kind of stuff. Now, something else to talk about. The brace aspect of this. Did I wind up noticing? If I was sitting down shooting these setups for groups, I would probably have noticed this deforming and moving around on me and generally being annoying. Probably would have driven me up a wall and I would be sitting here complaining about the brace. However, for working barriers, for doing a lot of dynamic type shooting, I did not notice having an issue building a cheek weld and maintaining a cheek weld and all that kind of stuff. It really wasn't even a thought in my mind as I was running through the barrier or doing shoulder transitions or any of that kind of stuff. Like, that was not something that I noticed on either weapon system with either brace setup. So I guess it wasn't nearly as big of a deal as I made it out to be. I still think that in some ways the SBRs have some advantages, but especially since currently I'm going to have to put that X95 kind of on the bench up until I figure out what's going on with that optic, I might have to start looking more seriously at a 3 points of contact pistol for a truck gun. Are kind of my end states here. All right, guys. Well, those are my findings. I hope you found the data interesting overall. Now, something I want to talk to you guys about real quick. The channel is now on Facebook. There is a Murph's Law official Facebook page. So if you guys like this content, you want to get a little bit more interactive with it, see some behind the scenes stuff, be able to get access for direct questions or be able to have like group discussions, forum discussions, and all that kind of stuff, go ahead and check out the Facebook page. I'll put the link in the description. All right, now, guys, I think that pretty much covers what it is that I wanted to talk about with this particular setup. Now, something else to keep in mind, guys, I guess there is one more thing that I want to talk about, and that is this gun had a couple of malfunctions out on the range. I think I included the video for that, but if not, I'll insert it here. That is something to consider with these ultra short setups. Now, this thing has been performing well. My friend has been competing with this for quite a while, and he's put a lot of rounds through it, and it has been doing very well. However, it is known with these super short 5.56 setups that they have a tendency to kind of rattle themselves to pieces because you're still talking about a significant amount of unburnt powder, a lot of energy, a lot of reciprocating mass, a very short gas system that can have a tendency to beat it up. Now, I did take this gun apart and clean it in order to make sure that this thing would function properly for my friend once he gets it back. And I took a moment to really inspect some of the internals, and I didn't necessarily see any major red flags on the bolt carrier or anything like that showing undue stress or wear. But it is something to keep in mind whenever you're buying these ultra short setups or building these ultra short setups, is you really have to take into account different aspects of powders and propellants and all that kind of stuff and what they do timing, all those sorts of things. It's a lot of stuff to think about, and a lot of people don't spend the time to think about it. So don't sell yourself short. Do your research. All right, guys. Now that's pretty much what I got. So have a good day.
Did not think I was gonna hit that first try. Well, there goes that.